A wildlife researcher named Roger Madrigal, a forestry scientist at the Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education Center in Costa Rica, was reviewing satellite imagery in the early 2000s when the numbers stopped making sense. The maps in front of him showed forest cover expanding on private farmland, not inside a national park, not within a designated reserve. On land, his predecessors' records had labelled bare cattle pasture, and the canopy was returning without anyone having planted a tree. Nature was simply filling the silence left behind. He had expected stabilisation at best. The models he inherited predicted slow, modest recovery if conditions were favourable. What the satellite data showed was something different, something faster, something the models were not built to explain. This is the story of how a country smaller than the state of West Virginia became the first tropical nation in recorded history to reverse deforestation at national scale. It taxed gasoline. It paid cattle ranchers to let the trees come back. It made standing forest economically competitive with cleared pasture. And what came back exceeded every prediction that had ever been made about what was possible. Almost nobody outside conservation circles knows how it happened. Almost nobody connects the fuel pump to the Jaguar, but the connection is direct. To understand why that matters, you need to know what was lost. Before the loggers arrived, Costa Rica was something that would challenge your vocabulary to describe. The country sits at the narrow waistband of the Americas, where the jungles of North and South America once met and mixed across millions of years of continental collision. That collision produced what ecologists call one of the highest concentrations of species diversity found anywhere on Earth. Costa Rica covers barely 1/30th of 1% of the planet's land surface, yet it harbours roughly 5% of all known species on Earth, more than 500,000 species of plants, animals, fungi, and insects, at least 900 species of birds, 250 mammal species, 400 reptile and amphibian species. The strawberry poison dart frog, bright red with electric blue legs, lives only in these forests. The resplendent quetzal, whose iridescent tail feathers the ancient Maya considered sacred, nests in cloud forests above 2,000 meters. The great green macaw, with a wingspan of up to 90 centimeters, moves through the lowland canopy in pairs, their calls carrying for kilometers. The Baird's tapir, weighing up to 400 kilograms, paddles through jungle rivers at night. In 1940, roughly 75% of Costa Rica was covered in dense tropical forest. The country sustained 12 distinct ecosystems, from coastal mangroves to highland cloud forests, where the trees are draped in moss and the air smells like cold rain. For most of recorded human history, this system had functioned essentially unchanged. Then the chainsaws arrived. In the 1950s, as global beef prices climbed and Costa Rica's population grew, the government began encouraging citizens to clear forest for cattle ranching. American lending institutions offered millions of dollars in loans to Costa Rican cattle producers to accelerate output for export markets. The economic logic was simple. Cleared land with cattle had a cash value anyone could understand. Standing forest had none that anyone had figured out how to price. So the forest fell. By the 1970s, Costa Rica was losing 50,000 hectares of forest per year. That is an area roughly the size of Singapore, disappearing every 12 months. Loggers moved into primary forest that had stood for centuries. Ranchers followed. Rivers that had once run clear under triple canopy grew thick with eroded soil. Streams that had fed hydroelectric turbines for decades slowed. The hydrology of the whole country was changing because the thing that managed it was gone. By 1983, forest cover had collapsed to approximately 26% of the national territory. In measurements from the late 1980s, it fell as low as 21%. A country almost entirely draped in one of the most biologically rich ecosystems on Earth had stripped it down in the span of a single human generation. The jaguars retreated into fragments too small to sustain viable populations. The macaws thinned from the skies. The tapirs disappeared from watersheds they had occupied for thousands of years. The land was not dead, but it had reached its lowest point, and almost nobody outside the country was paying attention. The idea that would reverse all of this did not come from a government ministry. It came through a non-profit organisation called Fundacor, an environmental group that had spent the early 1990s conducting economic valuation studies in Costa Rica's forests. Fundacor's researchers were asking a question no national government had formally tried to answer before in binding legal terms. What are these forests actually worth in economic terms to the people and institutions that depend on them? The answer was substantial and specific. Forests were regulating the water flows that hydroelectric producers depended on. They were sequestering carbon at a time when that carbon was beginning to attract international market interest. They were maintaining the biological richness that a growing wave of nature tourists were coming to see. None of these services had a price attached. None were generating income for the private landowners who sat beside the forest. And so, rationally, those landowners cut the trees. Fundacor launched a small pilot program on a group of farms covering 1,600 hectares. The idea was direct: pay landowners for the ecological services their forests were producing, not for the timber, for the clean water, the captured carbon, the wildlife habitat. The pilot produced results. Costa Rica's Minister of Environment brought the proposal to the National Assembly. In 1996, Congress passed Forest Law No. 7575. It was the first national law anywhere in the world to formally recognise 4 distinct categories of forest ecosystem services as measurable economic goods with legal standing: carbon sequestration, hydrological regulation, biodiversity conservation, provision of scenic value for tourism. The law banned land cover change in forests without government approval. It created a new national institution, the Fondo Nacional de Financiamiento Forestal, or National Fund for Forest Financing, known as FONAFIFO, to administer the new payments program. And it established the funding mechanism that made everything possible: a tax on fuel. The Pagos por Servicios Ambientales, which translates to payments for environmental services, began accepting contracts in 1997. FONAFIFO would sign binding 5-year or 10-year agreements with private landowners, committing to one of several activities. Forest conservation, meaning leaving existing forest intact. Reforestation, meaning actively planting trees on degraded land. Sustainable forest management and agroforestry systems integrating native trees into working agricultural land. In return, the landowner received direct cash payments drawn from Costa Rica's national tax on gasoline and diesel. The original law had earmarked 1/3 of fuel tax revenues for the program. In practice, the Ministry of Finance rarely delivered anything close to that amount in the early years. In 2001, a revised law assigned 3.5% of fuel tax revenues directly to FONAFIFO as a mandatory transfer. By 2003, the fuel tax was contributing an average of $6.4 million per year to the program. Today, 88% of FONAFIFO's total budget still comes from that single source. FONAFIFO established regional offices across the country. An inspector would visit each contracted parcel to verify forest presence or monitor newly planted seedlings. Landowners with conservation contracts received approximately $64 per hectare per year for leaving forest intact. Those undertaking reforestation with native species averaged around $162 per hectare per year under 16-year agreements. The payments were not large enough to make anyone wealthy. That was never the design. The design was to make standing forest economically competitive with cleared cattle pasture, which was earning some landowners as little as $8 per hectare per year. A cattle rancher in northeast Costa Rica, in the Sarapiqui region, named Pedro Garcia signed one of the early contracts on his 7-hectare plot. Garcia had worked the land for decades, raising cattle the way his neighbours did, the way his generation had been taught. When forest became worth something on paper, he stopped burning the margins and let the secondary growth advance, and then further. He planted pepper vines alongside native species. He introduced organic pineapple cultivation under recovering canopy. He stopped raising cattle entirely, Biologists visiting his property years later documented hundreds of species on those 7 hectares. Sloths in the canopy, strawberry poison dart frogs in the undergrowth, the scent of vanilla drifting from orchids on branch forks 10 meters overhead. Garcia was not a conservationist who had always wanted to restore a forest. He was a cattle rancher who responded to a price signal. That distinction is the entire lesson. For the first several years, the results were encouraging but not dramatic. The deforestation rate slowed. A few areas showed net recovery on the satellite maps. Conservationists were cautiously optimistic. The models suggested Costa Rica might stabilize its forest cover near 30% within a generation. The data refused to fit the models. The reversal began appearing in satellite imagery by the late 1990s. Forest cover had stopped declining. By the early 2000s, it was measurably growing, not just in protected areas but on private agricultural land across the country. Secondary forest was advancing onto abandoned cattle pasture. Native tree species were recolonizing hillsides that had been bare within living memory. By 2005, forest cover had climbed back above 50% of the national territory. Let me put that in context. Costa Rica had dropped from 75% forest cover in 1940 to roughly 21% at its lowest point. Within approximately a decade of the payments program launching, it had more than doubled that low point and crossed the 50% threshold. No tropical country had ever done this before. Stuart McGuinness, Global Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Group at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, described the result plainly. He said that in the 1970s and 80s, Costa Rica had one of the highest deforestation rates in Latin America, but it managed to turn that around in a relatively short period of time. He used the word remarkable. The word was accurate, it was also almost insufficient. By 2020, forest cover had reached from 53 to 57% of the national territory. The World Bank formally recognized Costa Rica as the first tropical country in history to reverse deforestation at national scale. In 2022, the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility issued a payment of $16.4 million to Costa Rica for independently verified emission reductions. The forests had become a product. But the cascade of effects went far beyond carbon markets. The hydroelectric plants that had been losing capacity as their watersheds dried out began recovering as canopy returned to their source catchments. Water tables rose in agricultural zones adjacent to recovering forest. Streams that had run turbid for decades began clearing. And as the forest returned, the animals followed. Great green macaws expanded their range into areas where camera traps had detected nothing for years. Jaguars were recorded returning to regions from which they had withdrawn. The taupo reappeared in river corridors it had abandoned a generation earlier. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the conversation. The same fuel tax that had been enabling road building and logging access for decades was now paying to bring the forest back. The mechanism that accelerated the damage became the mechanism that financed the repair. And then the full economic cascade became impossible to ignore. 3 million tourists were arriving in Costa Rica per year by the time the recovery was well established. More than 60% of them were coming specifically for the nature. Nature-based tourism was generating more than $4 billion in annual revenue. It was contributing roughly 8% of Costa Rica's gross domestic product and employing more than 200,000 people. Juan Robolino, an expert in environmental economics at the University of Costa Rica, observed that people in Costa Rica receive a lot of money because of tourism, and that changes the incentives of land use. This is not romantic nature worship, this is hard-nosed economics. The forest became worth more standing than cleared. And once that calculation flipped at the scale of an entire national economy, the recovery became self-reinforcing. None of this was clean or equitable. The programme's early years were marked by a structural problem that took years to address. To receive payments, a landowner needed formal legal title to their land. In Costa Rica, as across much of Latin America, people who owned land informally, small farmers, indigenous communities, colonists who had settled land legally but never processed the paperwork, were frequently unable to meet that requirement. Transaction costs of getting property documents in order could run higher than the first year of payments would cover. In the first years of the programme, large landowners received a disproportionate share of the contracts. A landowner with 100 hectares and a clean title could sign up with a single visit to a regional office. A farmer with 10 hectares and disputed documents faced months of bureaucratic process and legal fees. Many gave up. Some kept cutting, because cutting remained the path of least resistance. A smallholder in the Osa Peninsula region described the situation to a researcher from the International Institute for Environment and Development. He said the program had helped him and had given him the opportunity to ensure his economic future, not 100%, but he was not complaining. Then he added that the paperwork was getting more difficult and that if he became ineligible in the next contract period, he would probably start cutting, because the Environmental Authority did not have the capacity to stop him. That is a farmer telling a researcher quietly that the program is only as good as its accessibility, and that the people outside its reach are still making economic calculations of their own. FONAFIFO restructured the program in 2004, establishing 8 decentralised regional offices and shifting to a model that prioritised areas of low social development, land held by women and indigenous territories. In 2018, it added a sub-programme specifically designed for landowners with fewer than 10 hectares. These reforms helped, but the tension between environmental policy and social equity and land access remains unresolved. In a country where the forest grew back primarily on land that could prove its ownership, those who could not prove it were left watching from outside the benefit. Restoration does not automatically solve the problems that cleared the forest in the first place. That is the part of the story that tends to be left out when the recovery numbers are celebrated. Go back to the Sarapiqui region, to the 7-hectare plot where Pedro Garcia once ran cattle. Walk through it today and you will smell vanilla from orchids growing in branch forks overhead. You will hear the percussion of hummingbirds moving between tropical fruit trees so dense the light comes through in pieces. You will see sloths motionless in the canopy. You will hear frogs you cannot see. This is what bare cattle pasture looks like after one person with a price signal and 30 years decided to let something grow. Costa Rica has placed more than 1.3 million hectares under payments for environmental services contracts. It has transferred more than $524 million to more than 18,000 families since the program began. It has planted or protected enough forest to cover an area the size of Jamaica. And it did all of this by redirecting 3.5 cents of every dollar raised from selling fossil fuel. The key insight that changed everything was not scientific, it was economic. The forest was performing services that had real value. Clean water for hydroelectric producers, carbon storage for international markets, biodiversity for nature tourists. The only thing missing was a way to route some of that value back to the landowner standing next to the tree. Once that routing existed, the rest followed. The system rebuilt itself. Not the way engineers rebuild things, the way nature rebuilds things. Slowly, then suddenly. What surprised you most about this story? Was it the scale of the recovery, the simplicity of the mechanism, or the complications that are rarely part of the celebration? Drop it in the comments. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.